Hey Gary, wow, it's
Hi,
great to
how
see
you
you.
doing? Good to see
Wow,
you.
it's been a while since we saw each other. I guess it's been a couple of years now.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think so. And pre-beard, that's for sure. Pre-beard that you
Oh,
have.
thank you. Yeah, that's the COVID beard right there. So, Gary, well, it's again great to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to maybe spend some time with us and answer some questions around this article that you wrote. As you know, we translated this article to several languages, and we got a lot of positive feedback from it. A lot of good comments. Really enjoyed talking about this whole concept of rethinking risk assessment, adding the third dimension. I think a lot of people are still kind of stuck in that two-dimensional thought process, and it really helped them to think differently. But just for the audience, let me just kind of run by a little bit of your background right here. I've got some written right here that I'm going to read. Gary is an expert in safety management systems and organizational change. He is a two-time past president of the Hawkeye chapter of the ASSE and past Regional Safety Professional of the Year. In 2010, Gary was awarded the Distinguished Service to Safety Award, the top individual safety award from the National Safety Council. So that's a little bit of Gary's background. And again, Gary, a lot of people, good feedback here. So why don't you just start off by telling us a little bit of your history behind this whole concept of adding human factors to risk assessment and where all that kind of came from. Mm-hmm.
Well, it really starts a long time ago. I started my career in 1966, so that's ancient history. Uh, and I was an engineer, and I was a production engineer, and so we were putting together different types of operations, and we had some equipment that was particularly difficult to put together. Lots of injuries on it, and we had to figure out some way of predicting these injuries and then trying to put something in place so that we didn't have them. And that this is this was a long term issue, and we didn't know how to handle it. We really didn't know. We knew about risk assessments, and you could look at the amount of hazardous energy that's out there, and then we look at, well, how likely is it that we get into the hazardous energy, which, by the way, is the way most people do it even today. But we weren't getting data that seemed to be realistic, and we were struggling. So we're struggling with our safety performance. We were taking leading indicators and trying to figure out from them where we could predict something happening. And they didn't seem to match the data at all. The leading indicators we got didn't match the data that we were getting. I think that's a lot of safety people struggle with that. You spend a lot of time getting data, but it doesn't match. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't seem to coordinate very well. So we had lots of the issues, and then we had trouble with predicting really much of anything. And it really started out when we're looking at how do we get money for these changes that we want to make, and why doesn't management believe that we need to make these changes? And it just dawned on me that production data is hard data. If you have a production problem and you look at a machine and you say, you know what, if we got a new machine, we could double our production. That's hard data. And if you can sell the extra widgets or whatever it is that you're making, then you can actually calculate how much more money that would allow you to make based on your profitability predictions. Quality is kind of the same way. It's not as hard, but it's pretty hard. And in other words, we can make predictions based on the production data we get. Safety data isn't hard at all. It's totally soft. And the only time we get hard data is when we actually have an accident and we go, oh, here's what happened. We got all the facts in front of us. We know exactly what we're doing. So now we are
Right.
trying to get money to make changes. And all we can say is we're likely to have an injury here. And management doesn't like that. When they want to spend their money, they want to know hard data. So we had to figure out a way to get them hard data that was believable. So that's where risk assessments in general started, because we could kind of look at what we have, try and evaluate the amount of hazardous energy that's involved in it. And then we could look at the likelihood of something happening. Now, we didn't have human factors at first, but to understand how human factors kind of figure in, I'll give you an example. If you're driving 400 miles to a meeting, and you've done this drive many, many times, and you're a seasoned driver, and you know how to drive, and you know generally the traffic patterns, you have a pretty good idea what hazards you're going to run into, and you're driving along. But today you get tired. You're tired, but you want to make it to this meeting on time. And the more fatigued you get, the more likely that you're going to make a mistake. Now, you could make and use good judgment by pulling off the road, maybe stopping at the bathroom and getting a cup of coffee and then getting back on, but you don't want to do that. You keep going. That's a human factor. Fatigue is a human factor.
Right.
And the longer you go, the more likely you're going to fall asleep or at least doze off and run off the road.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't look at that if we were looking at a job. We just look at how much hazardous energy.
Right.
Cars going 60, 70 miles an hour. So there's a lot of hazardous energy, weighs 4,000 pounds, 5,000 pounds. But the likelihood wouldn't be there because we'd be saying, well, the road's wide, it's in good shape. We wouldn't realize that our fatigue, which may be caused by something totally unrelated, is changing the likelihood that you'll run off the road. It doesn't change the amount of hazardous energy at all. So when you look at hazardous energy and likelihood, we don't realize that the likelihood is a variable, and it's variable to human factors. So I think that point is important to get as we look at it. So production data is hard. I can make decisions based on that. I can trust it. Quality data is hard. I can make decisions based on that. But asking for money to change an operation or to redesign it, the first question management will say is, well, how many people have been hurt? Well, none yet. You're not going to get the money. But if you get somebody hurt, you're going to get all that you need and all your resources. And that's just bad business, and certainly not the way to run a safety process. So we were trying to figure out how to put that together and move forward. So typical risk assessments only have two factors, the amount of hazardous energy. And the way we look at that is we say, how much hazardous energy do we have? We make the assumption that you're going to get it all. So if you're working with 13,800 volts, we are making the assumption we ignore any safeties, any systems, anything at all. 13,800 volts, that'll kill you. So you pick a number. And my numbering system is a little bit more elaborate than this, but today we'll talk about this one. You don't get to pick zero on hazardous energy because it's never a zero, but you get to pick between 1 and 10. And in this case, you get in that 13,800 volts, you're dead. So it's a 10. So now we look at likelihood. Well, my goodness, we've got lockout systems, we have procedures, we have training, we have qualified people doing the work. Just how likely is it that they might get into that 13,800 volts? And that number would also be from 1 to 10, and it might only be a 2 or a 3. So now you add the two, 10, and we'll say 4, and divide it by 2, and that's a 7. And then people set up a scale. So that number, if it's between 2 and 6, we would likely not do anything at all. This is the old way of doing risk assessment. If it's between 6 and 8, we're probably going to be doing something fairly quickly to try and mitigate that hazard, either the hazard itself or the likelihood down. And if it's a 9 to 10, you're probably going to stop the job and you're going to really take care of it right away because it's a big, big deal. So that's kind of how we look at risk assessment today. But we don't really look at the risk assessment from the standpoint of human factors because they're different. We don't really understand human factors very well. I talked about sleep or lack of sleep. That's a human factor. We all know that when we're light on sleep, we make mistakes. And sometimes it's significant. Certainly forget something at the very least. or you might fade off, or your head nod when you're driving, those types of things. So we also have factors like going faster than normal. We talk about rushing, but really it's just going faster than we normally go. And we see that in
Right.
athletics when people try to get in a hurry and do something in athletics, whether it's soccer or baseball or basketball. They
Right.
different they make mistakes that they would not normally make. So the rushing and the frustration, that's one that's a little bit harder to get a hold of, but you might be frustrated because the parts aren't fitting together, the machine's not working right, high humidity, lower humidity, cold,
Hmm.
all kinds of things can cause you to be frustrated. So rushing, frustration, and fatigue, and then complacency are at least four human factors, and there are more. Those
Hmm.
four are the big ones we look at, and frankly, Safe Start targets all four of those. And so
Right.
and complacency is the hardest one to put together. So if we can put the slide up for the
Yeah.
complacency curve, I'd like to walk through that.
Yeah. G-
And
Gary, I did wanted to just kind of mention that because to me that was a point that really hit home to me was this whole complacency continuum graph that you did, and especially when it came around because when I'm traveling and visiting customers around the world, you hear a lot the concept of risk perception, and they're always questioning yourself. Why did the person not see the risk, and why didn't they perceive it? They try to make it very technical, but when I read this, it really took a little bit of the mystery away of risk perception. So yeah, if you could go in more depth there, that would be great.
so this looks complicated. And normally I would go through it one stage at a time. So we're going to start in the upper left-hand corner. And you'll see up there in the green a thing called awareness. That's labeled awareness. And in the lower left-hand corner, you're going to see what to me is a blue line. And so when people start a new job, their job skills in that lower left are way down. They have none. They still got a lot to learn, but their awareness is tremendously high. If you look at that lower
Right.
left, you can't get any lower than that because they don't know the job at all. But their awareness is really high because they really want to do a good job, and frankly, they want to be
Mhm.
safe. So
Right.
as their job skills go up, as we move from left to right on the screen, their awareness starts to diminish as their job skills get better. Now, we
Mhm.
normally applaud people getting better job skills, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same
Right.
time, as they get better at their job, their awareness level starts to naturally drop. In other words, they don't
Right.
have to think about what they're doing. It's starting to come naturally, like an athlete. They don't think about what they're doing. They've practiced and they've got really good at whatever it is, kicking the soccer ball or shooting the basketball. And so you have a point in time where people start where their awareness level will never be higher. It's up there on the top left, and their job knowledge will probably never be lower. And as that job knowledge goes up and moves to the right, you'll see it goes up. The line on awareness starts to come down, and it goes from green to a lime green to a yellow to an orange, and then they dissect there or they cross there. That's
Mhm.
what we call the first stage complacency. In other words, we no longer have to be thinking 100% about what we're doing. We are still able to do it. Now, we don't see very many injuries in this period of time where we're moving from the left to the right. The job skills seem to take care of the problem with the awareness level dropping. But when we get to the first stage of complacency, we start to have some trouble. Job skills will go up a little bit over time, but frankly, we've got to the point where we're competent and we can do this particular job. But you'll notice that the awareness continues to diminish. And we'll get down to the point, it's called the second stage of complacency, where we not only are no longer thinking about the hazards, we don't think about them at all. So we're driving our car 70 miles an hour and we are not thinking about driving the car at all. We're thinking about how am I going to pay my house payment? What am I going to do at the meeting when I get there? how am I going to present this information? So when you move from the first stage of complacency to the second stage of complacency, we start to see problems, and we really see those. So when we talk about the complacency continuum, it's natural, it's not abnormal, it's not evil. People do this naturally, and we do it all the time in everything that we do. The more confident we get, the less attention we have to pay. And so remember that when we start talking about people and why they didn't see the perceived risk or the risk. So that moves along. Now we have lots of things that we do in the safety world to try and bring that awareness level back up. Well, if you have an accident, it'll come up for a short period of time, but then it'll go back down. But pre-job checks, uh, design of systems, uh, training, everything we can do to try and keep bringing that awareness level up. But you'll notice it remains pretty low when we're doing a job that we're very confident with. Set that aside for a moment. Now let's look at this again. Up in the top left-hand corner, there are some dots that go through awareness, and they go down that green line, and they go through that black line, and then they go straight across the black line, and then you see them drop off or rise up. Okay, so what happens is when somebody starts a job, their perceived risk is higher than the actual risk. See, we can look at jobs and actually calculate a risk. And that's what that straight black line is that goes clear across. That's the calculated risk that we can do as engineers. I would question its accuracy, but it is, we think as engineers, we think the job goes from point A to point B. We designed it this way, and we don't think the employee is having any trouble at all. When in reality, the employee is constantly making adjustments during the day. Humidity makes the run different. So it's much more of a wavy line, but here we show it as a single line because that's the perception that the people who design the work have. Point A to point B, it's the same every day. It's the same every day. The risk level, that risk level, it starts out significantly lower than the top of the awareness curve. And that period there, the perception of the dangers of the job or the difficulty of the job are higher than it actually is. Then you have a period of time where the perceived risk and the actual risk coordinate. Okay. But when you get out to the second stage of complacency, what happens is the awareness level of the employee not only is dropping, but we actually see actual risk change. As their perception of the risk starts to drop, the actual risk changes, and it'll go up or it'll go down. And so what happens is you end up getting a gap between perceived risk and actual risk that is significant. And if you look at that, when those two get significant, that's where we get our significant injuries and fatalities, where the perceived risk is much different. And we look at the employee and we say, how in the world can you not see that? Well, the truth is, it's perfectly legit because we don't see that driving our car. We get in our car and go like crazy. We don't perceive that as this most dangerous thing we're going to do. But if you look at the data history for deaths, almost throughout all the world, the most dangerous thing we do is go out and get in our car and start it and drive it home. So it's natural that over time, as your confidence level and your skill level goes up, you will be less likely to see that perceived risk. So your perceived risk will just be diminishing. So what we're trying to measure when we add to the risk assessment the actual amount of hazardous energy and the likelihood, what we're trying to add are what do human factors do? Well, they make those changes. Human factors changes your awareness, and there's not much you can do about it. And everybody has a different point at which they get to a point where they think they know what they're doing. I tried to play baseball. I tried to play baseball at a professional level. And I found out I got to a certain point where I thought I was pretty good. And then they started throwing things called sliders at me. And there's a lot of young men that never make it to the majors because they can't hit a slider. And I'm one of them. I couldn't hit it. I was confident, but I just couldn't hit it and I couldn't react to it. So this complacency curve is trying to explain why we add human factors to our accident uh, calculation. So what happens then? So we go back and we look at human factors again, and we were looking at a job where I said we had 13,800 volts, and we said, well, you're not likely to get into it. So the likelihood was low, and the hazard was high. But as we get better at our job, some people call it complacency, some call it overconfidence, and some call it excess confidence. We're trying to mean this, it means the same thing. As they get really good at the job they do, we find out that the human factors don't pay as much attention, don't worry so much about our sleep, don't worry about doing things in a hurry because we've done it in a hurry before. And then as management, we reward certain things. Job I was at not long ago, the plant manager needed to get some parts out. They needed to go to an automotive plant. And the typical deal is 2 shipments a day. And there were about 400 parts in each shipment. And so in the morning when they started up the plant, they had parts left over from the night before. Then about 11 o'clock in the morning, they bring more parts over. And then now they have a full box and it'll take them into the second shift. But at 4 o'clock, they want another box shipped over there so they can continue the second shift and make the cars. And they're having trouble making the parts. They got the first shipment of the day over there, but they do not want to miss that 4 o'clock shipment. Even though that 4 o'clock shipment, if it didn't go over till the next morning, till about 8 or 9, would have probably been just fine. But he makes a comment to the employees and he says, we have to get this load out of here by 4 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I'm down there watching, and the work changed dramatically. It sped up. People were driving forklifts much, much faster. There was all kinds of activity going on. They evidently got the 400 parts in a wooden box ready to go. The truck backs into the loading dock. They don't wait for the dock plate. They drive right onto the semi trailer, drop the load down, come back out. They have to rev the engine up to get out of the trailer. They get out just slightly before 4. They close the door, and everybody cheers that they got it done.
Right.
They did all kinds of things during that period of time. So management systems can cause rushing.
Yeah.
And there's interesting data that also happens when people go on vacation. The week before people go on vacation, and this data is based on nearly 40 years, they tend to have more injuries. And when they come back from vacation, they tend to have more injuries. And we can even predict the type of injuries they're going to have. Before they go on vacation, they're more acute, cuts, bruises, broken bones. When they come back, they're more chronic, sprains and strains. If you think about this, this makes sense. They come back, they've been off for 2 weeks. So their muscle tone has changed. But why the beginning? Well, the beginning is their mind starts to wonder and think about the vacation, and they've done the job forever. Yeah. So it's vacation brain, and all that complacency curve now as it comes down, now we've accelerated that a little bit. It actually is lower than normal because we're thinking about all the things we have to do to prepare for a vacation. I had people tell me that when I did that data, I did it at a company I'd been with would end up having 30 years in. I was told it's crazy. So I shared it with 3 large automotive companies, and their data was the same. And because people had a certain amount of vacation each year, the week before and the week after, and the week before and the week after of the shutdown period, those people had in a 4 or 6 week period were having 60% of their injuries.
Wow.
That data tells you that human factors are changing that. The
Right.
thought of looking forward to something else or some other activity that
Mhm.
happens.
So,
We
Gary,
have,
would you say that that maybe, sometimes when we're working on this two-dimensional risk assessment, that a lot of the things that are low risk might, if we really start thinking about human factors, it's really not in that bottom corner, it's more towards the middle, and maybe some things that are high risk or more in the middle. Is that what I'm kind of hearing? Mm-hmm.
yeah, actually, you're right on. So if we look at the example I gave earlier of 13,800 volts and the
Mm-hmm.
likelihood, and we took those numbers and we looked at them and divided them out, it didn't get very high. It's 6, 7, whatever it might be. But if we look at human factors that can change, like fatigue, or they're going at their job a little faster, where they might actually forget to lock out or lock out improperly. You wouldn't think they would do that with 13,800 volts, but sometimes they do things that they've done before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And now you combine fatigue and this little shortcut that seems
Yeah.
harmless that you've been doing for 15 years, now it changes. So what I try and do when we're looking at human factors is we take the number for the amount of hazardous energy, we take the number for likelihood, and then we take a number for um, human factors. And I give them an example. Plant's been
Mm-hmm.
closed for a number of days, snowstorm, delivery is behind for their biggest customer. What is the human factor number? And they always give me in the class, well, the human factor number is an 8. So now we have an 8 and a 10 and a 2. And now we divide it by 3. And yeah, we're not looking at a risk assessment that sets in here about 6. We're looking at a
Yeah.
risk assessment that's up at 8. So you hit it, Paul. That's what we do. So I use all three numbers when I do my training, and we do actual risk assessments. But people in their plants can do a risk assessment right now. They don't have to have any special training. I would just like to have more than one doing the risk assessment because there's
Right.
differences within it. But you can look at a job and you can get a pretty good idea of what the hazard is if you make the assumption that I'm going to get in the hazard.
Yeah.
Because you always assume it's going to happen, no matter
Yeah.
what. So now we have usually a bigger number, and then we go, well, how likely is it? That will be the debate that you'll have, is the likelihood. But the debate is good because what happens over time is the people who are debating the likelihood, they learn more and more, and there's less variability in the likelihood over a period of time. So if you have 4, 5, 6 people doing risk assessments, at first they're going to be quite different. But it
Yeah.
won't take long before we start to find a common ground where we end
Mm-hmm.
up. So now we've got a risk assessment that accurately looks at the amount of hazardous energy. And then we look at, well, how likely, and we does a pretty good job of likely. And then now you can go over here and say, what if we've been working 12-hour days, 6 days a week? Does that change the likelihood? The answer is yes. What if we are on 24-hour shifts here and we do 12-hour differences each month? So one month you're on 7 o'clock at night to 7 o'clock in the morning, and the next month you're on 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock at night. I guarantee you, in those days where you switch from one side to the other, quality will diminish and injuries will increase. Excuse me,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't flip 12-hour shifts without having trouble. And if you have a problem with production and there's an issue, and now you are going faster than you normally go, and if that always happens at the end of the quarter, then you can plan on that. Say, hey, at the
Yeah.
end of the quarter, this risk is. So that's the whole idea, is to try and look at those things and then add human
Yeah.
factors to it. And we can manage human factors pretty well in organizations if we look at how we schedule our
Right.
work and what we do. But they don't like to
Right.
do. They like to do it in certain ways, and they don't like to have extra manpower, so we have less overtime. But we can
Right.
actually predict. And when you start looking at human factors and you back them back in, the numbers are
Sure.
significantly different.
Sure.
But the number
Wow.
of changes is watching.
Right. So Gary, kind of wrapping it up, what would be some maybe simple things that you could tell people to where to start with this whole thing? Maybe they haven't thought about adding human factors to their risk assessment. What are some maybe two or three quick things that maybe they could do to help them start doing that or thinking about it? Mm-hmm.
Well, the first thing is to do a traditional one. So go out and look at a job and just pick the highest amount of hazardous energy that's there, and then look at the likelihood. And I think that gives you a start. So you have a
Sure.
traditional way of looking at it. You know how much hazardous energy is there. There'll be a little bit of debate between people, but when you look at hazardous energy pure and likelihood pure, separate, then you have
Right.
a number. Then you can start doing what ifs. And if and you when you start doing what ifs, you're looking at, and I would start with the big four: rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency. And I would look at all those. And rushing and frustration and fatigue are pretty easy. The complacency thing, you just need to know on time. As people get more confident with their job, they'll start doing things that they maybe wouldn't have done at the beginning. But I would never look at those like blaming the employee. I would look
Right.
at those as natural things that people do. You do them, and I do them. And I still get hurt once in a while, and I've been doing this stuff for like 50 years. And
Yeah.
I got an example of one that happened in my garage just 3 months ago, and it's perfect. I can easily look at it, and I can look at how much hazardous energy was there, and I
Mhm.
can look at the likelihood was really low, and bingo,
Right.
my complacency or overconfidence level was way too high. So if they just start, you have to do the first one, and that's what we did. We did in the 60s. We started doing them traditionally. And then we realized the gap later on. But at least now, and the big answer now is today, I can do a risk assessment and present it to management, and it's
Mm-hmm.
hard data. It's hard data now. Now we have a system. And when the numbers are up around 7, 8, or 9, management starts to believe the 7, 8, or 9. Before they wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
believe it. So we get on equal footing with the production people and the quality people, and we can at least compete for resources. So we don't have to have somebody get hurt to get the resources. Now we can plan ahead. And then now we can spend our money wisely and we can do much, much better. So that's what I do. I start out with a few and I isolate it to maybe one or two departments. I wouldn't try and do the whole
Okay.
facility. I just kind
Okay.
of start with 12.
Excellent. Great, Gary. Yeah, and we'll also, at the end of the video, give out your information in case somebody has some questions and would like to reach out to you sometime. But yeah, I thought the article was great. I really appreciate you writing it. And again, I think it just gives us a great perspective to think differently, especially the one that really hit me was that complacency, how, and again, like you said, it's not about putting blame on anybody because really if you think of complacency it's a non-deliberate, it's just something that happens over time, and where the first thing we start looking at is whose fault was this. It's just a natural process. It happens to all of us, and we want to be the first ones to blame people, but in reality it's just something that could have happened to any of us because we're all falling into complacency all the time. So
Absolutely.
so great thing. But man, it's great to see you, and really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy, but appreciate you taking the time to kind of enlighten us a little more about this whole concept of rethinking assessment. So
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm glad this article has hit a chord with some people. I'd be more than happy to help if I can.
excellent. Thank you, Gary. We hope you continue having a great year, and hope to see you soon after we can start getting together a little more. Mhm.
That'd be fun. Thank you.
Sounds good. Take care.